rights police break up a protest agreed in advance with authorities, using crowd control tactics familiar to Palestinians in occupied territory, certainly not familiar to Israelis in Tel Aviv.
Oakland socialists had the chance to talk with Ofer Neiman, who lives in West Jerusalem. Ofer is a longtime fighter for Palestinian rights and a longtime participant in the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, BDS, including in a group called BDS From Within, meaning from within Israel. Here, he talks about the situation in Israel right now. We started by talking about how we had met, which was through support for Ukraine against Russia's invasion.
As we all know, probably there's quite a rift in the international left around the Ukrainian issue as well as the Syrian issue. And personally, both of us strongly support Ukraine.
We then went on to discuss the main topic of the day, which is the ongoing protests in Israel against the so-called judicial reform bill.
Yeah, so the current crisis revolves around a broad sweeping initiative by the Netanyahu government to overhaul the judicial system. And it basically amounts to a soft coup. They are trying to weaken the Israeli Supreme Court. And their main objective is to make it easier for any Israeli government to treat Palestinians even more harshly, to annex Palestinian territories. But there is also, there are other components. I mean, this proposed reform would probably marginalize other population groups within Israel. And it's important to stress that even with the current Supreme Court that we have, of course, Israel is not a democracy. It's an apartheid state, and the Supreme Court is arguably the main pillar, actually, giving a stamp of approval to the apartheid that we have here. But it still functions, it still can operate some brakes, checks and balances, if you will, against sweeping initiatives by the Israeli government, especially a Likud government, such as the current government. And this is a problem for the right wing that's currently in power in Israel. And they have a broad range of amendments and proposals and laws which they are trying to enact. Right now, the main issue, and this has already passed in Parliament, is an amendment to abolish the Supreme Court's authority to annul various decisions by the government for being unreasonable. The Israeli right wing believes that the Israeli Supreme Court should not have the power to overrule government decisions and disqualify or annul them based on their being unreasonable.
In the United States, the two main issues that are being stressed are, one, the role of the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and two, Netanyahu's legal troubles.
So this coup is being driven primarily by a right-wing elite. You could say many of them are religious, not ultra-Orthodox, a right-wing Zionist, partly religious elite with strong connections to the US. We can say more about that later, to the Republican Party and to right-wing circles in the US. They wish to change, again, so it's not just about the Palestinians, they wish to change the face of Israeli society to make it more conservative, more right-wing. So it also has to do, I mean, one of the reasons that Netanyahu supports this reform, first of all, it's his own political circle, but he also has his ongoing trial in mind and his attempts to sort of break free somehow force the courts to rule in his favor. And there is also within the coalition that we have right now, it's a right-wing ultra-Orthodox coalition. Naturally, in the past 2 or 3 decades, the ultra-Orthodox have also become very right-wing, but they have their own interests, and some of it has to do with expanding the applicability of Jewish religious law in Israel. In Israel, there's no separation of state and religion. For example, typically, if you want to get married in Israel, you have to get married in accordance with Jewish religious laws, and there are Jewish religious courts. And of course, they do not rule according to modern law, they rule in accordance with halacha, Jewish law. And as we know, any traditional religious code tends to be or is likely to be discriminatory towards some groups, towards women, for example, sometimes towards minorities. And the ultra-Orthodox, they wish to expand, for example, they wish to expand the authorities of Jewish religious courts, the family courts, in matters of marriage, divorce, custody, and even beyond that, some of these conservative circles would also like to make it more difficult for women to have abortions in Israel. So again, you can see the connections, the similarities between Israel and the US.
I'm guessing that there's probably an element of anti and like homophobia involved too.
Yeah, I mean, anything that has to do with these conservative ultra-Orthodox people, of course, they do not accept LGBTQ rights. They are against that. Actually, our Minister of Finance, who is not really ultra-Orthodox, Smotrich, he's quite famous by now, he's a settler. Years ago, he organized in response to Pride Day and Pride Day parade in Jerusalem, he organized something called, I think it was called the Beast Parade, marching donkeys in Jerusalem to sort of argue that LGBTQ freedom amounts to inherently to bestiality. So yeah, this gives you sort of an example about their mindset, of the mindset of conservative, right-wing religious people here in power.
I asked about the role of the Israeli Supreme Court as providing a cover, a pretense for fairness and democracy in Israel.
The Supreme Court has to be perceived by the international community as an enlightened democratic institution which applies checks and balances to Israeli, far-reaching Israeli government policies. In reality, this court has given its stamp of approval to the construction of settlements, to the deportation of Palestinians, for example, Palestinians accused of various offenses, including a prominent Palestinian American activist, Dr. Mubarak Awad, who organized nonviolent resistance to Israel's occupation in the 1980s. He was deported. And as far as I can recall, the Supreme Court gave its stamp of approval to this deportation. So there's an irony here because the Supreme Court is actually not a friend to human rights activists and to the Palestinians. It's very powerful in the dispossession of Palestinians, and in a way, if the Israeli government tries to act against the courts, Israel is going to lose a major shield against action abroad, sanctions, lawsuits. Once the Israeli Supreme Court is no longer perceived as a bastion of democracy and human rights, then we're going to, and some of the protesters are saying that the Zionist protesters are saying we are going to be exposed to lawsuits abroad without the Israeli Supreme Court in its current form. It's not just about opposition to the more harsh aspects of the 67 occupation. It's also the wish to weaken the settlers and people like Netanyahu in order to gain more power within Israeli society. I would say that there's still probably, in terms from a social economic perspective, they're still, I mean, they are the elites, but in terms of demographics, they're somewhat on the decline. They used to be all powerful in the 60s and 70s, and they would like to regain some of that power. So some of it is sort of a domestic internal power struggle within Jewish Israeli society. Some of it has to do with opposition to the settlements and the 67 occupation. And you could say that the Supreme Court tends to represent that point of view. Yeah, but of course, some of the judges, some of the rulings that we've had in the Supreme Court have been quite harsh and very hostile to Palestinians, and the language is often very strong militaristic language. But overall, the Israeli Supreme Court is strongly supported by liberal Israelis, less so by the religious and ultra-Orthodox populations.
I asked about a comparison between what you could call the radicalization in the United States, the far-right populist movement, and that in Israel.
We're seeing that within the Israeli right wing, but I think that some of the radicalization that we're seeing here has to do with the occupation itself, with religious right-wing politics in Israel, with their own plans, which are not new, to control the entire territory between the river and the sea, to expel Palestinians, to rebuild the third temple on the ruins of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. So there's also a strong element of religious fanaticism, which is not that new, which has deep roots. So some of the processes are similar to what we're seeing in the US, the conspiracy theories, the Trumpization of within the Israeli right wing, but there's also a strong element of religious fanaticism here.
Right. I mean, you're seeing that here too, but because
with the evangelicals, perhaps. But and there are strong ties between some of our religious fundamentalists and the evangelical extremists. But I think that beyond that, there's also a far-reaching extremist agenda here, which is actually at the core, at the roots of the construction of settlements beyond the 67 borders. So some of these settlements were actually supported even by the Labour Party, but this is being predominantly a project led by religious fundamentalists here, actually since the late 1960s, just after the 67 wars, if you look at the roots of the settlement in Hebron. So I think there's a very strong project here with local aspects and local roots. Nowadays, they have a very strong alliance with right-wing groups in the US, but they also have their own agenda.
We compared the role of the US and the Israeli Supreme Courts.
The US Supreme Court is controlled by a conservative majority. I think it's 6-3 currently. So yeah, that's a difference here. But there is some similarity because we're seeing attempts in the US to nominate and appoint more and more right-wing judges, and this is exactly what we've been seeing here. They would like to see, the right wing here would like to see more conservative judges in the Supreme Court.
Right.
So they are also trying to reform the processes by which judges are nominated and appointed. So they're trying to overhaul the courts and appoint more conservative right-wing judges.
We talked about how Israeli racism and attacks on the Palestinians, led by the Israeli settlers in the West Bank, but not only conducted by them, how all of that is now coming back to haunt Israeli Jews themselves.
Absolutely. One typical example, and I can send you the footage, is when you see police brutality towards protesters, anti-reform or anti-judicial coup protesters in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. The violence, in some cases, it's sort of can remind you of what you're doing, what Israel is doing to Palestinians. Of course, not at the same level. They're not using rubber-coated metal bullets. Certainly, they're not using live ammunition. But they're using very powerful water cannons. And what's more symbolic than a veteran Israeli pilot, almost 70 years old, was a senior pilot in the Israeli Air Force, who actually lost an eye after being hit by a water cannon in Tel Aviv. And you see his photo without the eye. And most of us are familiar with these horrible photos of Palestinian children and youths losing eyes to Israeli violence in the West Bank, of course, in Gaza at the time. So now you have these pictures of members of the Israeli elite in a somewhat similar, not the same, of course, I'll never say that it's the same, but in a somewhat similar position. And people are talking about that. Yeah, they're saying, especially this week, now that this amendment has passed, they're saying, they're connecting the dots and saying the violence that has been perpetrated against Palestinians and these right-wing elites, which actually have grown in the West Bank within the settlement project, are now trying to take over, to take control and change Israel from its roots. And I think there's a very strong sense of perceived threat here that now, just like you said, that it's coming right back to bite liberal Israelis in their posterior. Yeah, and especially within the Likud, which has been Israel's predominant ruling party since 1977. Yeah, I mean, historically, Likud was based on this commitment to democracy. And most of the founding figures, in fact, they were very secular, even if they were sort of traditional. They were secular. They believe in secularism to some extent. Likud has been taken over by settlers and their supporters, and also by Kahanists, these extreme right-wingers. So if the founding figure of Likud is considered to be Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who was against the religious state. He wanted to see secular democratic law in Israel. And even though he was a hard right fanatic, he believed in equal rights for Arabs. Nowadays, the people within the party are, for the most part, closer to Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was an American Jewish rabbi who actually founded this so-called Kahanist movement, which seeks to marginalize and even expel Palestinians and constantly incites against Arabs, including the slogan "Death to the Arabs." So nowadays, Likud is closer to that than to its historical roots.
Ofer also explains the other side of the coin.
And we're seeing a massive wave of refusal by reservists serving in so-called elite units of the Israeli army. And these units are historically and currently manned by liberal Zionists, pilots, commando units, in the intelligence corps, and they are refusing. They're saying we will not serve under this anti-democratic government. Some of them are even saying, even if it's not just about standard training, if there is a so-called operation, I will not report. And this is something which poses tremendous difficulties for the government, and it's going to keep growing. And within several weeks, the IDF chief of staff is likely to tell the government that some of the units are no longer in operational mode. I think that we're also going to see some decline in terms of economic indicators, economic and financial indicators for Israel. We're already seeing some downgrading of Israel's credit ranking, and there's a massive loss of investments in the Israeli high-tech sector, which has been very powerful. New companies are either being registered in the US rather than in Israel, or investors are just deciding to I mean, even if these are Israeli if these companies are started by Israelis, and beyond that, some international investors may just look elsewhere. So I think that if this goes on, the Israeli public is going to witness some sort of economic decline, and everything that we've mentioned here favors the protesters.
I asked how this will affect the situation in the West Bank.
We're seeing right now a sort of end game in the West Bank. The Israeli settlers are trying to grab as much land as possible, and they're willing to use violence more than ever before. They've also sort of infiltrated the ranks of many combat units on the ground, perhaps not the so-called elite units, which are still controlled by more liberal Israelis, but the combat soldiers serving on the ground in the occupied territories, the border police, some of the infantry brigades. There's a lot of support for the settlers, for the right wing. Many of the soldiers are right wing or settlers or religious folks. And there's a lot of collaboration between the settlers and the military. It's a joint operation. And I would use the term ethnic cleansing here. Pogroms, violence, attacks on Palestinian villagers, trying to root out Palestinian communities. And I think that this year, already 3 or 4 small Palestinian communities in the periphery have been driven out as a result of settler violence. So it's ongoing ethnic cleansing, and we're going to see more and more of that. This means several things, but one implication is that the occupation and the violence caused by occupation will stay on the agenda, including international agenda, because when settlers perpetrate a pogrom in a village such as Hawara, 3 months ago, the world is going to see that. People will know. There's footage, and now with a government that's quite supportive of this violence, and with military forces on the ground which are supportive, we'll also probably see stronger pressure for various lawsuits against Israel and legal proceedings against Israel in international tribunals.
And how about the situation for Palestinians inside Israel? Number one, are they involved at all in the protests and also just in general? How about the situation for them?
Yeah, for the most part, they are not involved because there is so much militarism so many Israeli flags in the protests, and many of these protests revolve around this narrative of we are the people who actually defend Israel. We are the pilots, we are the senior officers. We are the elite of the intelligence corps. It's not a natural place. It's not a political home for Palestinian citizens of Israel. They don't feel comfortable there for the most part. There is a growing anti-occupation bloc within these demonstrations, certainly in Tel Aviv. People with slogans focusing on occupation and apartheid, calling for refusal. Most of them are Jewish Israelis, and also holding up Palestinian flags rather than Israeli flags. So it's probably it's natural for Palestinian citizens of Israel to join one of these blocs, but it's not natural at all to join the broader demonstrations. And there is, so you're familiar with the word chutzpah, right? Which is a Hebrew or Yiddish word, having the nerves to do something. So perhaps the epitome of chutzpah here is that from time to time, we see some preaching by the organizers telling Palestinian citizens of Israel, why aren't you joining these protests? It's for you because you don't want an extreme right-wing government. And we have to remind them, police brutality certainly against Palestinians in the occupied territories, but also discrimination and violence, lethal force has also been applied against Palestinian citizens of Israel by successive Israeli governments. I mean, Israel has not been a liberal democracy to Palestinians, and that includes Palestinian citizens of Israel. There's always been a small minority here of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, who are opposed to the occupation. Since the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000, especially after Ehud Barak, Prime Minister Ehud Barak from the Labour Party, who told Israelis and the world actually that the Israelis don't have a partner for peace. That was very destructive. Ever since that time, only a small minority of Israelis has been active against the occupation. And things probably became worse under Netanyahu in the past 12 or 13 years, with growing efforts to marginalize Israeli activists and Israeli groups active against the occupation. But what we're seeing right now is that some people are connecting the dots. Israelis understand the connections, or more Israelis understand the connections between what's going on in the West Bank, and also, of course, there's the occupation of Gaza and militarism here in general, and the judicial reform. So more people are joining the anti-occupation bloc. It's still a fairly small minority within huge demonstrations, but it's growing. And I suspect that there's an even larger number of Israelis who are still within outside of that bloc. They are the ones who are still holding up the Israeli flags and chanting all these Zionist slogans, who understand, perhaps they're still reluctant to articulate this, but they understand that it's strongly connected to the occupation. And so I think we're going to see growing opposition to the occupation. And there's also, it's going to be impossible now for these liberal Zionists to argue against refusal, because over the years we've had always had a small number of refusers, Israeli soldiers or even conscripts, the 18-year-olds who refused to enlist altogether, the draftees, refusing to serve because of the occupation. And historically, there has been strong opposition to such refusal from liberal Zionists, telling us, the military should be beyond any political debate. How dare you? You must serve. We're under an existential threat. But now that these people are refusing very strong, just saying, I will not report. I will not report, even if there is some operation and I'm called up by the military. They will not be able to lecture us on refusal, and it's going to be easier for us to talk to the Israeli public about refusal to serve or refusal to enlist because of the ongoing occupation and apartheid.
We concluded by talking about how much of the same left that opposes Israel's invasion of and occupation of the West Bank in effect supports the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What I've seen, the majority of the pro-Palestinian forces internationally, for instance, here in the United States, take a position of apology for Putin's invasion.
Yeah, there's a genocide in Ukraine, and Russia, Putin, they're perpetrating a genocide in Ukraine. And it's not just a genocide, it's this under this umbrella, political, ideological umbrella of the so-called Ruski Mir, Russian space, which is a lot like Hitler's Lebensraum. It's a genocidal war of expansion, and we should all be opposed to that. It doesn't mean we have to agree with Zelensky, complimenting the Israeli government. Of course not. But first of all, we should be Antifa, anti-fascist, anti-genocide. And it's so frustrating to see so many American leftists who either support Putin or just think that this is a symmetrical conflict and that NATO is to blame here, and that they are and those people who are opposed to arming Ukraine. If we don't arm Ukraine, there will be a Russian genocide there. And sometimes I would like to ask these people. I mean, there's so much incitement against Zelensky. So yeah, I mean, I criticize him if he compliments the Israeli government for sure, but so many conspiracy theories against Zelensky as a Nazi. I mean, compare Zelensky to Winston Churchill. The US supported Winston Churchill against Hitler during Hitler's Lebensraum war. Zelensky is surely better than Churchill. Churchill was a mass murderer, a colonialist. He had so much blood on his hands. And as far as I can recall, as far as I know, most American leftists, including socialists, communists, Marxists, they supported US aid to Churchill. Now, perhaps you know more about this. Perhaps it only began when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. I don't know. You tell me. But overall, if people can justify US support for Winston Churchill, they should definitely justify arming Ukraine and supporting President Zelensky against Putin's.
Yeah, it strikes me the real parallel here is Russian invasion of Ukraine and what amounts to Israeli invasion of the West Bank.
I think we need to work hard to bridge this gap between this divide between typical Western liberals who strongly support Ukraine but do not speak out about Palestine, and hardcore Western leftists who support the Palestinians but do not stand with Ukraine. There's a common thread here: anti-genocide, pro-human rights, anti-fascism, anti-occupation, and so on. And so I think it's very important for socialists who are pro-Palestine, pro-Ukraine, to try and bridge these divides and show that it's possible to sort of consistently stand up for the right things.